Summer school, 2004, the Iridology and Natural Medicine class. This is the introductory lecture where I really love to present a wide spectrum of iridology, of my own discoveries, and also introduce you to some of the work of some of the amazing teachers in the world of iridology. So we're going to look at a lot of beautiful images. We're going to rest our eyes from time to time on a flower or some sort of sacred geometry pattern. And we're going to prepare to be able to really look at eyes and begin to discover of the amazing levels of information that you can receive, you know, physically, socially, yes, even how you process life socially, emotionally, mentally, and even the karmic, spiritual destinies. I mean, it is an amazing field. So this is my eyes, which we are beginning a lecture with here. And my eyes changed a lot. That's how I discovered iridology, because as a child I had what you call hazel eyes. They looked quite brown, they had a lot of yellow, they had a lot of green, they had a lot of markings on them. And while I still do have some yellow kidney pigments and just a little bit of pancreas pigments and a couple of very, very tiny pigmentations, you know, here and there, which are more in the range of the melanin color, the liver color, the dark brown, tiny little ones. Mostly my eye now is blue. When I did my first cleanse at Healing Waters in the early 70s, where I did, you know, the living food for the first time and a 40-day fast and all the juices and all this, you know, saunas and steams and exercise. When I came back to work at the spa that winter, everyone just looked at me and said, "Your eyes have turned blue." And so that was how I sparked my interest. I just thought, if my eyes could change color. And so, but that is a very controversial point in the world of iridology, how much eyes change. And I have seen eyes change enormously because the naturopathic process and the herbal process that we do with purification, regeneration, and transformation, the eyes change naturally. But if you don't do purification, if you heal with other modalities, if you use homeopathy and so on, you can get healing, yes, you certainly can. But it's very different. You do not experience the levels of... So anyway, there's a whole world of personal experience behind my own eyes that I like to share so that you really understand that my first experience was transforming the color of my eyes. And my vision completely... I had worn glasses since 9 years old. And after that 40-day cleanse, when my eyes turned blue and I had all these experiences and I started to see the world for the first time, I didn't need glasses until I was 55. But later on, it also will go over my eyes another day, and I'll tell you about the immune reactive constitution and some of the other aspects of it, but we'll move on for now. Resting our eyes on the unfolding rose, which I really believe is the key of transformation, is to understand that you're continuously unfolding. And the more that you cooperate with the process of unfolding, the more you realize of yourself. Instead of holding yourself back, you keep moving forward. Truth is never revealed all at once, but petal by petal. Unfolding petals showing their beauty, their design, and so on. And also the messages in water. We actually went to see the movie last night, What the Bleep Do We Know? And they had this incredible scene where the lady is in the subway and she just misses her train. And there's a display of messages from water and how thought transforms the crystalline patterns just as if they were snowflakes. Makes you wonder what's happening up in the universe when all the snowflakes become crystals. You know, because here thought has transformed and created this absolutely beautiful pattern of transformation. And so to incorporate that into the world of iridology by how we purify, how we cleanse, how we transform, we actually change the crystalline patterns of our thoughts, of our feelings, of our bodies, and so on. So we resonate with these truths of the universe. And so all of us begin in life as an embryo in the womb. We all experience somewhere in our primordial conscious memory that has not to do with words. We went through a process of transformation. And during that process of transformation, the eye was a very large part, and is indeed the only part of original brain tissue which meets the outside world. And it has an eye stalk that connects it directly to the hypothalamus. You have to see this movie. Last night it showed a pulsing, vibrating, pounding hypothalamus, and all these visionary things to do with emotions and social behavior and the questioning of who I am, where I'm going, and whatever. I mean, it was very interesting to see that in a movie, the hypothalamus. But anyway, this goes directly into the hypothalamus, and there's over 30,000 nerve endings that they have discovered in there. And in my early days of research, I would look up medical books, and it would say there's 30,000 nerve endings, but we don't really know what they're all for. But as iridologists, we learn what they're for, because the body is continuously sending signals to the iris, and the iris is changing as we change our life. And this is the very beginning, when we actually almost were conceived. Here's the sperm trying to enter the egg, and the amount of energy of how the receptor on the feminine egg is going to receive, which sperm and so on. But I love the energy of that particular dawn. And here we have the embryo, and you see how large the eye is from the very beginning in its stages. It's very, very large in proportion to the rest of the body. Here's the spine, beginning to form this very large eye. And this is the second stage of how, once the cell is, the egg is fertilized, the embryo begins its journey of expansion into creative form. And it goes through many stages. And the question that I like us to think at this point is, at that stage, did we have any idea who we would be today? Do we really have any idea at any time what we will be, or what we can be, or how much we can be? So this is a very interesting question here when we look at somehow this was us as we were created. And then once again we can look at the shapes, the embryological shapes that actually create the optic cup for the iris and the vision. And you have to turn yourself inside out sometimes to see how the inner and the outer shapes take place, and how things fold, and how things expand and contract in this creative stage. And you see, the amazing thing is that those energies are still at work in us, with expansions and contractions, with unfoldings into the mystery of life. And so we have, you see, all the stages that this went through for the iris to be held in its earth shape, held in its bowl, for it to be able to be placed in such a way that it can see the world. I was once very fortunate in England to visit an embryological show that they had at the British Museum, where all of the stages of embryo were created in huge things that you could walk through and inside out. I would spend hours in there. It was very close to where my practice was at the time. I could just never figure it out. It's so complex, the way that everything folds and unfolds and changes, through these stages. It's almost oceanic. And cells multiplying, dividing and multiplying. Now this is an iris mandala from last summer. This was done with string and grains of grass. So when you move into your iris mandala project, just enjoy yourself thoroughly and get into the feeling of your own iris in relation to the world and the things that you've chosen to work with. And once again, this amazing folding and unfolding that creates the spine. And there's the eye. From this to this, and there's the eye. So the eye is there at a very early stage. And inside here we have the nervous system, digestive system, communication networks, and the beginning of the skeletal. So we have no real memory of this, of course. It's way beyond words. But it's there inside of us, the memory of that. This memory of growth and evolution and transformation. And that's what we really want to dip into, is to once again participate really fully with that energy. We do that with the mystic yoga. That's what I've been evolving over the last few years, is how to tap into that. And here we have the organs developing. This is very important to remember when we think about the pupil and the iridology markings in the pupil later on. The embryological spiral of the formless into the form. And here you have this beautiful drawing by Alex Gray, which I highly recommend you look in all his books, because of the way he depicts the energetics of life, showing the different stages, with a great focus in his particular approach on the heart. Another iris mandala. So many beautiful ones over the years. And most of these people felt very resistant and nervous about doing an iris mandala. You are not alone. But you're doing it for yourself. You're not doing it for anyone else. And you have no idea what wonderful things you will do once you start. Energetics of the iris, a large wreath. And then we begin with a chart here, Dr. Jensen's chart, which I'm very fond of, although in my own being I also incorporate information from the German charts and other charts, and also some very beautiful work by Leonard Milmauer of the sclerology approach to iridology. And so, there's certain things, that's why it's so important to draw a chart, because it takes time to memorize it. You have to think of this as the inner world. This is, the spine is like almost like going down the center. Half of the spine is here, half of the spine is here, one thyroid, other thyroid. So you have the center and the spinal areas, and it's like going right down the center of the body. The kidneys being inward, and then the spleen on the left side, the liver on the right. But the Germans are more accurate with their different approach to analysis, because they made us realize that the heart is here, but the heart is also other places. And the pancreas, which is a very long organ that goes from left to right, is in quite a lot of different places. So you will notice some differences on the chart, and of course some of the main critics of iridology are always saying, iridology charts are always different, that's why they're no good. But the fact is that they're more same than they are different, and that's the main thing about iridology, is people focus on different aspects of it. And in different cultures, there are different conditions that are more predominant in how people produce diseases or how they age. And so it's only natural that a chiropractor like Dr. Jensen would see the iridology and look for things in relationship to structure and spine and so on. And that Dorothy Hall would focus more on homeopathy and herbs and see different things about the emotional life. And Joseph Deck, who was in the war and saw many people die of all kinds of conditions, both from wounds and also from fevers and illnesses and shock. His experiences. And see, if we all take the view that everyone is contributing to the larger field, and eventually now everyone is beginning to bring the information together, and how it will evolve over time now with more communication. And I loved being a part of the communication many years ago with the bringing of all the teachers to England, and everyone meeting everyone and communicating and learning from each other, because that's generally our approach. So you will learn from me, but you'll go out and you may think, oh, I'll go to a conference, or I'll go study with this other teacher, or I'll buy their books, Farida said they were really good, and so on. So there's a lot to be learned, but we want to start somewhere with a really clean slate and just go, I'm just really open to everything, just like this white rose. You see in here we have the Joseph Deck's chart. I met him in Germany. I went to visit him and was very fortunate to spend a day and an evening with him and visit his clinic and have him show me his iris photographs. And if you think this is big, he had an immense wall and he had all this, highly, highly expensive Zeiss projection equipment, and he would just zoom in on one little tiny place and he would go, there, that was the cause of death, and look at that transversal, and it would be magnified huge. He was fascinated with detail and with really small places. And if you read his books, he became very mystical toward the end of his book and the end of his life. He began to see some of the other things on the mental and emotional level. And so it's very interesting, but you see from his chart how it differs from the Jensen chart by adding in more detail in the pelvic areas and much less detail in the head areas. And so if you've ever been to Germany, they eat a lot of ice cream, they eat a lot of cheese, a lot of bread, a lot of beer. They love to eat, and they're very social, and they enjoy it all. And apparently, as Lee Hauser explained to me, kidney troubles are really, very, very high. And of course, lymphatic and circulatory and heart things as well. But in the chart, you see they have the pancreas in several places. And the pancreas over here and the pancreas over here. And the heart is over here as well as over here. And so it's important to really study and get to know the different charts. And some of the things, because the approach that I teach is about inner ecology and is not about detail. It's about understanding the entire inner ecology of a person in all levels of influence. And by working with purification and regeneration and growth and evolution, I have my own way of looking at the eye. And some of my students over the years have gone in completely different directions, and they can see things in the iris, and I go, how do you know that? And because they're different. And one of them, the Bradburys in England, Peter Bradbury, he can tell extraordinary things in the eye. And before he was an iridologist, he was someone that was into measurement and into science and mathematics, and his nature is to look at things in a different way. So it's not that we're all that different, it's just that we're ourselves, and there's no control in the universe about who is going to come to us. And I used to love to say this in conferences, just because you haven't seen something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Because you could see eyes for 10 years and never see an eye with a particular thing in it. Or, as many times happened in my practice, all of a sudden I would get 9 people in a row with arthritis. And every single eye would be different. And I'd just go, wow, what a lesson the universe just gave me. Or I'd have a whole series of people with kidney troubles, and half of them would have similar markings. And so as I began to work with iridology, the universe was always gifting me with these experiences. I never had any control over who was going to come and what kind of eye they had. And so we always really want to keep an open mind. Just because we haven't seen something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And we can explore these many, many rich experiences of the iridologists around the world as well. The blood supply to the iris. Dr. Jensen's book is most magnificent. I highly recommend, adding it to your library whenever you can. And it's very important to see the work that he developed. And he had, artists working for him and so on. He really devoted his entire life to the foundation of iridology. And here we have a cross section where we see the lens of the eye, and then we can also see it from this point of view, the pupil, you see, going back, and here's all the nerves. And then the part that we're looking at is around the pupil. And once again, the iris anatomy here. Now it's very important to understand this is the edge of the pupil. What is underneath comes up, and we see little granules around the pupil, which is called the pigment rough or the pupillary margin. It has different names. There's a great movement led by Leonard to get everyone to start using the same terms of iridology. And so you can imagine this coming up. And you do see changes in this which mean a lot in terms of nourishment and the central nervous system. But it's very important to know, this circle going right around the pupil, and the pupil goes right back here. Okay. It's also important to know that there are height and depth in the iris. We can use a light to show more of the contrast of height and depth, and also in Photoshop we can use contrast to bring up the highs and the lows and make us see a little bit more of the heights and depths. But the wreath going, you see here's the pupillary margin in a circle with the pupil there, and then it comes up to the autonomic nerve wreath, and then nerve rings or sensitivity rings most often go down. And when you look at it with a biomicroscope, or you look at it with high magnification, or some of the things that I'll show you on the computer, you can absolutely see the heights and depths. And this is the center of a flower. Kind of zoomed in on that one. I really like the energy of it. And once again, a really beautiful drawing here, which shows the different layers, because in a brown eye, this wonderful velvet cover of the color hides a lot of what the blue iris so reveals so openly, with all the different fibers. And then we have the blood vessel level. And occasionally one of these blood vessels will kind of burst through the iris and be pink or swollen, or even sometimes highly dramatic red. And so these vessels can sometimes come through. But most of the time with the brown eye, you get the simplicity of the lacuna, the fibers, within the wreath or the collar at the nerve rings, pigmentation. But it doesn't mean that you understand the eye any less. It just has a different way of looking at it. And then you have the muscular layers that pull the pupil or contract it, the expansion and contraction. So all these different layers are there. And I really love this from Joseph Deck's book. Joseph Deck's book, I have one of them, and I will put out the books on the tables through this week, and I would really try to get a hold of them if you can. And a lot of students have found them on eBay and on the web, and put searches out for them and requests for them, and they find them whenever you can afford it. But toward the end of his life, as I was saying, Joseph Deck got very mystical, because here he's showing the iris, and he's saying the pelvic areas are the roots, and the respiratory lung throat areas are the leaves, and the brain is like the flower. So this is very helpful to us to think of the iris in the same way as you would an organic plant. Now these are drawings from my book. When we start to look at the iris, we need to look at it from many different points of view. It transforms the way that we look at things. We look at the center and move out to the edge. We look at the top and the bottom. We look at the right eye and the left eye. We look at the inner eye toward the nose of both left and right. We look at the outer, left and right. We look at the relationship of the top to the bottom. We look at how things circle around. And we go in and out and around. The most important marking, what strikes you first, the shape of the wreath. So you begin to develop a holistic mind by learning to look from many different points of view. A holistic mind does not look from one point of view. It looks for relationships and correspondences and how things affect one another. We don't just look at the effect, we look for the cause. And this is a very, very big part of what we're going to be learning this week, is how to actually look this way and change how you think about things and how you receive information, how you process information. It's actually going to change many things for you. And the holistic anatomy and physiology assignments in the Iridology course are actually designed to further that process also. because it helps you see how if one organ, system, or gland isn't working, how the other ones have to work more. So it's an inner ecology thing. If one thing isn't doing its job, something else has to take over and compensate. So in the healing process, the idea of getting everything back to doing what it needs to do, getting everything working and functioning again, will take so many problems away just naturally. And so the inner ecology approach is something, I've evolved over the years because I love to think of life as a symphony. I'm not a detail-oriented person. I need to understand how things work and feel their relationship to each other. That's my approach. And certainly that's proved valuable over the years. So when we look that way, we might notice a lacuna up here and a radial here and a lacuna here and a lacuna here. But if we look at it from one point of view, we'll see a relationship and it will look like a cross. Or we might see a relationship with radii solaris or swollen fibers or pigmentation. If we look at it, we go, oh, it's just like a cross. Or it might be markings up the top filling this area, like several lacuna, or maybe color from the transverse colon with a lot of radii solaris, and then down here some strong markings. So it isn't that you're going to see lines in the iris, you're going to see shapes that create patterns and dominations that make it look as if these things are happening, as concentrations of energy. And you also get like three things in an iris that create a relationship between one and another. And that actually, because a lot of people say, oh my goodness, the eye is so complicated, I don't know where to start, I don't know what to do. And so right now I'm helping you to see that there's many different ways that you can approach an iris and see things. And the more relaxed you are, the more receptive you are, the more open you are, and the less that you're carrying in the brain, the more you see. Because the iris speaks to you. It totally speaks to you. Some irises have extraordinary pigmentation in the pelvic areas and none on the top, or the same with lacuna or radii solaris. And then we see sometimes radiations of swollen fibers or groups of fibers going up. We see things at right angles. And also we see sometimes a lot of nerve rings on the right eye and none on the left. Sometimes it's equal. Sometimes we see nerve rings really a lot on the outside and the inside, but hardly any over on the other eye. And all of these are giving us messages and telling us things. The rings of Saturn. The inner universe and the outer universe. And here we have circles. Now what I've done is taken half of an iris here and then extend it out. So here we have the light of the spirit, we have the pupil, the energy, the life of the person. If a person isn't alive, there is no light coming out, no consciousness. So here we have the pupil, we have the pupillary margin, we have the stomach area, and then we have the autonomic nerve reed, which controls all the functions, including digestion. So we have that ring, and then we have the utilization of energy which is absorbed from the colon and radiates out through circulation and lymph and so on into the muscles, bones, and organs. And then on the outside, the maximum utilization and then eventually elimination. And then also the interaction zone of the person's life with the environment and markings in the sclera coming towards certain parts of the iris, magnifying or augmenting the markings that are already there. So circular relationships, are quite strong. This, I believe, is from Angerer's book, which is almost impossible to get, and so I want to share quite a bit of that with you because you can't really buy it anymore. I gave it to my students in Malaysia and then was never able to reproduce it, and I was so glad that I had put some of these on transparencies for teaching. Now, the iris wreath is that shape, that irregular shape. See, first of all, we have the pupil, then we have the pupillary margin, and then we often have a stomach zone, which is quite distinct. It isn't always distinct, but in blue eyes, sometimes it can be like white, and it can have little lines running through it. It can be gray, it can be yellow. And it can have many things happening inside of it. Usually the shape of the wreath is clear. However, sometimes it does get covered by clouds of lymph or mucus or clouds of pigmentation. So you can't actually see the fiber of the wreath itself. But don't worry, it's there. And often as people purify, it reveals itself and you begin to see it. So once again, we have another way of looking at the rings in terms of zones, and we can measure with the clock in different ways. Mostly we use 12 o'clock, but you can also use 60 or 360 if you're very detail oriented and want to be absolutely exact. Now, one thing about iridology is that you can have a very strong marking in an area and have, say, if we would say this would be the anxiety area of the brain. But often there is also an influence going on to the areas which are next to it. Or you could have, a lacuna down here with some dark marking in the lymph zone and then it affecting something else. So these are called adjacent relationships, and sometimes they can be quite important. And they're especially important if you have a sign in an area that shows that there's really something there, the iris is speaking to you. And then all of a sudden you notice a transversal is crossing it, there's a lymphatic tophy in the same area, there's a swollen fiber, there's a bowel, diamond heart shaped little. The more things are present in an area, the more strong the message that the iris is trying to tell you. Now this is from a German book, Krieg, and this is quite wonderful because it shows the squaring of the wreath. And indeed this does happen with some irises. You look at the iris and in one corner of it, the shape of the lacuna, the shape of the wreath of the colon area, which is actually what it is, creates a square in the corner. So on the right iris, this would be the hepatic flexure of the colon, which would be related to the liver. And on the left side, it would be the spleen here. And of course, down here in the sigmoid, over here, around the appendix area and the lower part of the ascending colon. But you can notice that often the squaring of the circle has to do with chronic difficulties. And so it's something to pay attention to. This is some of the students last year working on their iris mandalas over at the barn. And then back to Joseph Deck's book here. This is something I'm very fond of. He's let us know that he's on the island of Kos in Greece. And he's got a leaf of Hippocrates plane tree on the island of Kos. So he's gone there and he's having all kinds of visionary and mystical realizations about iridology. And he's saying the stages of the human embryo from the fertilization to the development of the 3 germinal layers. So we have the fertilization of the ovum, the first phase of division, what he calls morulation, the blastocyst. I showed a picture of that yellow one that was beginning to take all kinds of bumps and shapes. And then the development of the 3 germinal layers here. Now the 3 germinal layers that appear in biology in many life forms are the entoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm. And the entoderm is the gastrointestinal tract. An analogy to this is the worm, the primitive form of life of the worm, which consists only of rings. And I often like to think of the intestinal tract as a worm, because when you see how a worm moves, it does this peristaltic action, which is what we want from our colon. That's how it moves, that's how it dances, that's how it eliminates when it's working really well. So he's saying here, the gastrointestinal tract is a hollow organ with mouth and anus at opposite polar ends, has not yet developed any sense organs. And then we have the mesoderm, which develops as blood and lymphatic system, and then the ectoderm, which is the arrangement of organ segments. And he's saying, here's the iris. Here is the first one, the digestive zone, and then we move into the mesoderm, which is the blood and lymph zone of the nutrient coming out from the colon and the digestive system, and over here, the ectoderm, the arrangement of organ segments. And I think that that's quite important to come back here into endoderm, mesoderm, ectoderm, and see how the iris itself reveals the evolution of these different aspects of life. They're needed in order for us to live. We have to be able to take in food, we have to be able to digest it, it has to circulate with blood and lymph, and then it has to be utilized by, through the organs and tissue segments. And so that's a very nice work that he did here. So this is an iris map terminology from my book, which helps us to identify and to talk about the iris. So if I say medial, I'm meaning the area of the iris that's closest to the nose. And if I'm saying lateral, it's the temple area. So medial and lateral are very important terms if you're talking about the iris, especially if you're teaching it or asking questions. Superior area, inferior area, those are sort of have a sense of judgment to them, so we take that away from it. And the temporal area is up here, lateral, lower temporal, and then the medial. And then the upper nasal and the lower nasal. So at some point it's good to learn those so you can speak. Now these are some of the things that you see in the iris over and over and over again. And actually in my book I was the first one that I know of in the history of iridology to bring up the fact that lymphatic rosaries are all different, nerve ring patterns are all different. They tell us many, many different stories as to where they stop and start, what zone they are with the lymphatic rosary, what shape they are, what color they are, and all the different positions. The stomach ring appears sometimes as a white halo in a blue iris. Radii solaris can come from the pupil, they can come from the stomach zone, they can come from the wreath, they can break through the wreath, they can come all the way, and they have many, many different ways of manifesting in a particular iris, of going through different areas. And so that's one of the first things that you learn, is that every iris is really different. And the same with pigmentation. The old word for that is sora. But we tend to use pigmentation now because sora is a homeopathic word which has to do with itch. And interestingly enough, in my practice in England, I sometimes actually had clients who had a pigmentation mark, and they actually had an itchy skin associated with it. And so some of these things are true, but then if you change the vocabulary, it includes all things to be possible, not just one. And then crypts are these tiny little markings. They're not really like a large lacuna, but the crypts always land right on the autonomic nerve root. And there's different kinds of heterochromia. Heterochromia means a different color. So sometimes the collarette or autonomic nerve root is actually covered by a heterochromia of yellow or orange or brown or black-brown or different colors, and we can't really see it. Sometimes the heterochromia covers the entire area, which is a very deeply introverted, concentrated pattern. Sometimes it will come out in a sector, like over a liver or over a particular area of the body. Sometimes the heterochromia will cover just the stomach, and sometimes it will just be part of a sector instead of the whole sector. Many different things are possible. And then we look at what has been called the sodium ring, the calcium ring, the hypercholesterol ring. Has many different names. I like to call it circulatory hardening because I relate all the things I see to the functions of the organ systems and glands. And it can be very, very white. It can be solid. You cannot see through it, but it can be very transparent. It can be very like a light mist in the beginning, that you can just only sense that the white is beginning. You can have it as an arcus senilis just over the brain area. And this is also a medical term that they are aware of, where the mental faculties become diminished, where concentration and focus and communication, memory and so on become difficult. And then you can have insufficiency of circulation to both the head and the extremities. You can have a very transparent ring here. You can have a very strong pattern of a white ring with a skirt ring or a dark ring around it. You can have a very dark ring around the iris, in gray, dark gray. You can have it in many different colors. And so the great thing is that not everything appears in the iris all at the same time. In the beginning it seems like an overwhelm. I know you think, how are you ever going to work through all of that? So again, we can have a complete white ring. We can have a central heterochronia with a dark ring around the edge. We can have a white stomach halo and a white ring. And these are very mandalic patterns, aren't they? They're producing something, an amazing, sometimes like white and white, or dark and dark. And these are the things you want to be aware of with that kind of receptive, easy, relaxed vision, where you let the iris show its pattern to you. It reveals its color relationships. It reveals where, the lacuna are. Here we have a white autonomic nerve root and a lot of white lymphatic tophi, which produce a very strong pattern as well. This is from the book that Ghafran Safi in Lebanon and myself produced together, where he went through all the teaching materials in the Dictionary of Iridology and made drawings, relating to some of the possibilities that might be associated with the different patterns. And this page, here is to do with bowel conditions. These are many of the different, there's so many possibilities that it's good to, study that as a part of your preparation as well. Now the edge of the iris also takes many forms. Very, very soft, distinct edge. The migraine neuron net that has to do with tiny little red capillaries, and often people do have migraines or headaches when they have that, what Dorothy Hall calls the B3 bulge, a digestive insufficiency which balloons out over the sclera in like a very faint gray shape. And there's an interaction zone here between the inner and outer of the person, the sensitivity of the skin, how they relate to the world. And many times psychological or personality things can be understood by the quality of this edge of the pupillary margin, the person and the world. And often, of course, the sclera is coming right to something, telling us. And then these cannot be drawn small enough, but they are like tiny little wisps of very delicate hairs, and you need a 9 times magnifier to see them, that can be on top and bottom or just one and the other. And it seems that many or most or all of the people that have it here have a strong relationship to natural energies, nature, the earth, weather, and that the people that have it up here have a great sensitivity to psychic things. And this has proved itself many, many times. But it's like you don't look at it and then say to the person, you're a psychic. Or you don't look at it and say, you're a weatherman. That's the one thing we don't do. We don't assume, but we may learn to ask the right kind of question. Or they may just tell us. And then we see it, and then we say, oh, you have that ability, and look, here in your iris. There you have that, and we've found that many, many times to be true. It's all so much in the way that you learn how to communicate these things, so that you inspire people, you make them feel really good about themselves. You don't make them feel bad about themselves, and then you challenge them to become even more. So how you communicate with people and how you describe these things and how you teach them about themselves is absolutely the essence of the best kind of iridology. Not to frighten them or make them think I never want to have an iridology reading again. All they did was tell me terrible things. Life isn't like that, is it? Here's the center here of another iris mandala that is really lovely. She put the rainbow in a spiral. Unfolding rose. And over here again we have the pterygium, which is a cholesterol. It seems to be both pressure, blood pressure, and quality of blood. The Dorothy Hall says also to do with the sun, because she's seeing more and more and more of this. The thinner the protective field is in the air zones, it's, but you do see them in the sclera, but sometimes they encroach into the iris. And that was a very particular interest of mine, is if something happens to the iris, operation, accident, pterygium, how is that affecting that part of the body? And we found many times in England, myself and my students, that in all three of those cases, when things came over the iris, that the part of the body would become affected. It wasn't getting as much light, or it wasn't getting the communication, or there was a relationship that was not only about the inner showing up on the iris, but about the outer showing up on the inner. It's a two-way communication. So that was very interesting. Sometimes you see out here in the sclera. Now the anemia ring is a kind of bluish quality that surrounds the iris. And it really is almost impossible, I find, to recognize it in photography, in iris photography, because of the lighting and the shadows. And so it's something that if we think it's there, we want to look in the iris. But so many of the irises that will come up will have this darkness around the edge because of the lighting. So it's quite important not to think that everything is an anemia ring, because it just isn't. Not with the photography anyway. Here's another iris mandala to inspire you for this afternoon. They can be quite simple. It's really lovely. Now, in Caribbean, African, Indian, Oriental, people that have very brown eyes can also have the brown melanin come out onto the sclera. And I have done much work over the years, particularly in England, because it's such a multicultural country where people would be there from all over the world, and I would work with people. And so many of the students that I worked with, they did immense, beautiful purification. They lived really clean and well, and this color never went away. So in the end, I found that I disagreed with this, which is in my book. She calls it a leprosy miasm. I actually really disagree with that. I think the color is a natural phenomena, and that I have not seen it associated with anything. And it would be wonderful to talk to her after so many years, because this was about 17 years ago when I brought her to England, and she was thinking about this. And when she spoke about it, she said, I'm exploring this, I'm watching this, I'm seeing this. And of course, we all have miasms in homeopathy, but I just want everyone to be totally clear that this is not a disease thing. It does not come from a condition. It is the color of the iris, spreading up into the sclera. And I really feel very clear about that. Now this beautiful picture here is an iris pigment at like 1,000,000 times magnification. So in the cell itself is a spiral. John Miles shared this photograph with me. He showed it at a conference in Sydney, Australia. And I just think that's so magnificent. As you know, I work with spirals so much, with movement and cranial, and life evolves in spirals. And there it is in the iris pigment itself. Now this I saved from Dorothy Hall's visit to England many, many years ago, which I thought was quite wonderful. She had been to Egypt, and she had gone into the museum in Cairo, because in the ancient times they used to make statues, and they used to make eyes. And she said she actually found eyes that had come from very large statues that had paintings on them of the iris markings. These I have never seen, but I will never forget her saying that. And then she speaks of how the ancient symbol of the eye of Horus, which was the physician, contained the eye in it. And today the eye has been taken out of it. So we just want to put the eye back in it. And they used to use this as a way of measurement and so on. But the eye of Horus was a very important aspect of healing in the Egyptian times. Now this is Catherine from last year's summer school, who had the biggest resistance to the iris mandala of all time. And we always do the completion session just before we have our graduation, of the summer school and the certificates and all that on Friday. And in the last hour and a half, she did her entire iris mandala. Up to that time, she just couldn't do anything. And she produced the most absolutely magnificent mandala just in the last. So I really honor resistance. I always feel that resistance is actually leading us to something really fantastic. So I encourage you to all go through your resistance. And this is something that I drew when I first studied with Dr. Christopher way back in 1976 in Arizona. After he left, I drew this chart as well as an Iridology chart as well as a reflexology chart. And I actually sent copies. I redrew them all over again on large poster board and sent Dr. Christopher copies of them. And he actually phoned me and thanked me. But as a person who had done a lot of reflexology and zone therapy, where we have the large toe is ether, second air, fire, water, and earth, and we have the elements in the toes. These actually relate to parts of the transverse colon, and then they relate to the brain areas, and also in the hands. So I was already at the very beginning of my work with Iridology, bringing in correlations, bringing in understandings, and how things actually work together. So this is, over 20-something, I can't even remember how many years now. And this also, Dr. Jensen did some great work on the reflex areas. You can have the whole colon can be completely healthy, completely clean, completely perfect, and then you just need one area sending toxins up. So I redrew this. The nerve structure of the colon is the starting point of reflex irritation, so that the spreading out, you see, through the circulation. Certain bacterial poisons have a certain specific effect on the nerve fibers and the organs to which the nerves are related. If there is an acute irritation in the bowel, there will be an acute irritation in an organ. I've always been very, very grateful for my teachers, for the iridologists and naturopaths and everyone who created the foundation on which I was able to do my work. And I always honor their work and share it. Another iris mandala. So our irises are true flowers, unfolding in the universe, filled with beauty, mystery, amazing truth, connecting us, the inner and the outer world. So this here is helping us to see the height and the depth in the eye. This is the pupil, and this is the autonomic nerve wreath. And there has been quite a few books, French and other ones, that show how different it can look in a cross-section depending upon the stresses, the size of the pupil, the stresses of the nervous system, and so on, blood conditions, blood pressure, how the shape of the wreath can really have many different kinds of heights. You see, in my book here, many different kinds of heights and depths and shapes from a cross-section view. This is from a French book, which also shows pointing, rounding, swelling, ridging, quite large, and so on. Now this is very interesting work of Dr. Jensen's, and also something that was explored in great depth for many years, the attempt to bring Hering's law of cure into the iris of the eye. Does the iris have lacuna that will suddenly, after healing, fill in, or does it not? And it was a really beautiful exploration, but what I have found is that with purification and regeneration, with exceptional nutrient herbs and food, along with the purification and elimination, that the colors that were settled in the lacuna leave And then you begin to see the fibers, but myself, I believe the fibers were already there. I have never seen a lacuna fill in and disappear. And also you see from Dorothy Hall's work, you begin to, and also from the Rayet model, you begin to see that the lacuna offer many, many positive and wonderful things on social and emotional and expressive, creative levels. So instead of seeing the ultimate eye as one without any lacuna, and so on, we begin to see that every kind of iris has its strengths and weaknesses, and we'll go very deeply into that later on. And so this is a theory which has some truth to it, that, you know, in conferences and so on now, we don't actually have the belief that these lacunas fill in. And it was such magnificent work, especially with all the colors here, because this is so true. You know, as something develops in the iris in a blue eye, and it becomes acute, the iris whitens, and there is hyperactivity in the body. And then eventually the body cannot carry on the hyperactivity, and the color begins to gray, and as it slows down even more, dark gray and eventually black in chronic and degenerative conditions. And this retracing of the homeopathic concepts of the Hering's Law of Cure that we retrace. And when I brought Dr. Jensen to England in 1981, that was my main conversation with him, because in his extraordinary clinic, he would have these, you know, very, very ill people with, you know, extreme cases of psoriasis and so on, and he would put them through his protocol, and they would build up and have these very, very intense healing crises. And I was telling him at that time that I was developing ways with the herbs and the nutrients and the naturopathy to actually minimize the healing crisis, so that it wasn't necessary to be so extreme with fevers and so on. And that's, you know, been the approach that I've tried to evolve over the years, is to prepare the body to receive the healing, to activate, you know, the inner ecology with the illuminative channels, and to really prepare the body to go through incredible healing and rejuvenation without great suffering. And in the work that I did with the Bristol Cancer Clinic and the Gerson Cancer Clinic in England, in many of the cases that I worked with 12 years of clinical practice, I was able to prove this to be true. And so you can have healing crises, and sometimes they happen in small ones like yours, you know, but they quickly change, don't they, once you do the right thing. Once you help the body and support the body, then the body can move beyond that reaction. And it's really true. You see, the acute fiber rises up and becomes white and hyperactive in the degenerative. But you see, not all lacuna are degenerative. That's what we want to make clear. If a lacuna is filled with absolute black, or if a radii solaris is filled with absolute black and there's a great deal of toxicity into the system, you can say, yes, degenerative, yes, chronic as a part of the picture, but you can also have that without any lacuna at all. You can have people dying of cancer without any lacunas in their face. So we have to see things in perspective. Lacunas in themselves are not chronic or degenerative. It would be the life of that person and where they were in their continuum of health or toxicity. So here we have the pupillary rock, these wonderful, wonderful drawings from Dr. Jensen's book, all the great love and devotion put into all of this. Acute, normal, and then the darker ones. But everything has to be seen in relationship. This was a wonderful iris mandala from Gary, who is Australian, and you can see the Aborigine influence in this one. And this wonderful book again, Dr. Jensen's, showing the different systems. This was quite a breakthrough too in the study of iridology, to separate the different systems and show how they appear in the iris. So that, oh, the respiratory system is here, here, and here, and here, and so on. And the illuminative system, this is how the body illuminates through the liver, you know, through the lungs, through the skin, and so on like that. So that's very useful to study that, and I believe one of your assignments in the courses helps you to do that. And the different shapes in the wreath we have here. We have a squared wreath. We have a wreath that goes in that has a stricture. partially squared reef is quite common, one that's obscured, one that goes in and out in all kinds of dramatic directions, and one that has a prolapse in the transverse colon. And once again, we have the chart to bring everything into perspective. So we have, lacuna, radials, trophy, all appearing. You can see the lymphatic and circulation, you can see the skin, pituitary. And when I first looked at it, I went, PP, what's that? Payer's patches. Pit G, pituitary gland. Things like that, little shortcuts. Transverse colon, solar plexus, duo for duodenum. Pan for pancreas. So there's some shortcuts in there. But, now these wonderful developments by Leonard Mailmauer, the colors and the iris, he's done some magnificent work with all the colors, and it's really wonderful to get on his website, to buy the books, to buy the charts when you can. And this particular one is about all the different colors in the iris. You can see the different shades of yellow that have to do with the kidneys. And then we move into oranges colors, which has more to do with adrenal and pancreas. And then we have reddish orange, a fluorescent orange, which can be gallbladder deficiencies, red or orange, bone loss, brown or orange, pink. It doesn't really have the red, the really brilliant red of the fibers that swell up that I've seen. I think this, the kidney yellow. But all of these colors appear in the iris, and they're very, very helpful to understand those. And the physical iridology pigments, the chart has two sides, and it's so very useful to have. And so, you're looking at pigmentations and colors that appear on the surface. And there's a real difference in the colors because they look like paint has been splashed. It's like thrown. A lot of the pigment is very irregular, almost like newsprint. If you bring it up, it's splashed on the top of the iris. On the screen, which I'll go through reasonably quickly because they give you an idea of how the colors look, the way they're splashed. They're splashed on top of the iris. And I have seen these colors change, just as they did in my own eyes during my first experience of purification.
This is not splash.
This is a splash of creativity. Fishes and stars. Melanin being it's scattered. You see, it has rough edges a lot of the time. And during purification, the ones that I have seen disappear. And one of my first cases, one of my first students in England actually, she had very weak kidneys, and I did a couple of road trips with her to the Lake District, and we used to have to stop the car every half an hour, every hour for her to pee. And I mean, you couldn't touch the bottom of her feet. And she went through, the herbs. She studied massage with me, she studied reflexology, and she actually, during her healing, transformed from being a music teacher and eventually became an osteopath. And now she does amazing teaching of osteopathy all around the world. But her pigments actually completely disappeared, along with her kidney weakness. And that was one of my very strongest lessons, was her particular transformation. And these are very, very high magnification here. You're seeing a lot of the texture of the paper. But just to give you an idea. And here we have pigmentation in the pupillary zone. Orange, yellow, brown, ochre, and orange. Pancreatrophic pigmentation, as well as solitary pigments, frequently occur on the left. Hepatic pigmentation on the right. Hepatic means liver, and of course the liver is in the right iris. So basically what he's saying is that the hepatic pigments are more dominant on the right side where the liver is. And this just gives us an idea of some of the possibilities to look for. And it depends, on your emphasis as you develop in the field of iridology, which direction you go, how you build on the foundation you're receiving here. You'll probably make some great discoveries. Now this particular chart is showing some of the subtleties of the digestive system. The esophagus, the pylorus, the posterior wall of the pylorus. You can get very, very definite and very exact, if that is your nature, with a lot of the German charts. They really show exactly where the stomach comes in and out and so on of the iris, as they do also, with the circulation, with the pulmonary arteries. And it's quite beautiful, really. And once again here we have the esophagus, the posterior part of the duodenum. The duodenum is a place where you do get markings quite often, but then they've got the descending duodenum over here. So it's coming, into the liver gallbladder area and then over there. Another beautiful water message. They had one last night in the movie called Chi Love. And so that's what we do with our healing. We recreate all of our crystalline patterns through our thought forms, through our feelings, through releasing from our body. We begin to resonate and harmonize with amazingly beautiful patterns in the universe. And then we return to the colon. I always like to put the two together, the idea of how we transform into beauty, and then the cold, clear reality of having a clean colon and dealing, with the exactness of elimination. We don't want to hold things in our being on any level, whether physical, mental, emotional. We want to allow the process of elimination to keep things clean and clear. So if we look at this chart here, we can see a normal colon, this wonderful work of Dr. Jensen's, the prolapse colon, the spasm, the balloon, the strictures, the diverticuli, the colitis, all the inflammation of the colitis. I've worked with some colitis patients over the years where they were taking cortisone enemas, and they were having like 40, 50 bowel movements a day, not able to retain anything. The emotional life that went along with that. In one particular case in India, a very high-born, very wealthy Indian woman in Delhi, and she was basically on the point of life and death. 40 bowel movements, constantly having cortisone enemas. Huge 3 black marks on her descending colon, as clear as a bell. It was all emotional. I started taking her case history as a friend, and she was stuck in the Indian system. She had no power, she had no money, her husband was away on business all the time, she was separated from her family, and she just was suffering intensely. She was highly creative and poetic and intelligent, and she wasn't allowed to do anything. And she did break free. Her mother sent me to her, and the next time I went to India, the mother took me and said, "We're going for a drive." And I got in the car with the chauffeur and drove us out in the country and asked the chauffeur to get out of the car. And then she said, "What have you done to my daughter?" "She's angry at everyone. She's telling us all off. She wants this, she wants that. There's no end to her demands." And she just was really, really emotional. I said, "Well, she's still sick." And "No, she's getting better." And she went through this immense release period where she just spoke her mind and brought up her fire, and then she did create a life for herself. She got a driver's license, she got a little car, she got money, she invested in movies, she started treating horses with Bob Flower remedies. She was the one I told you about last week that would watch all the movies, and then just go, "This person needs century, this person needs rock water, this person needs holly." So, when a person gets free, obviously it can make waves in the person's life and around their life with their family. But we go to the colon, and what we see is the result of the emotions and the tension and the stress and the struggle and the lack of speaking. That's why the story is significant. Because when I first saw her, she had 3 black spots on her colon. in her iris, as clear as a bell. So it's the stories that make it come alive. It's the clients that prove the truth. It's your own experience of what happens to you. We're not talking about imaginary things here. We're talking about real things. This has all been the result of 25 years of looking at irises and healing people and working with what I'm teaching and what I'm very happy to share and to have carry on. So over here again, we're seeing on the screen more of the shapes of the bowel pockets, the possibilities for the breaks in the reef, the possibilities for the open structure of the colon. And when sometimes as a student, when you see this, you just think the body is just completely weak. And structurally it is, but socially this person has tremendous adaptability and consideration. We have flower petal reef. We have the net type of reef that's very, very strong, that seems to rise right up and create a separate pattern over the top of the iris. And then we have this beautiful page from Dr. Jensen's colon management, tissue cleansing through colon management, I believe it is, where he shows what comes out of the colon, the mucous membrane. In England, I showed this book to everyone. And I said, this is your colon, and this is why you have these conditions. And what we're going to do is slowly remove all of this from your body so that you can absorb nutrient and have a healthy colon and healthy elimination. The more toxic your bowel, the more inability there is for any nutrient to pass through the walls of the colon. And so you begin to receive nutrient and energy from eating. And so you eat more and you eat faster and you want to get the energy from the food in your mouth and, in your stomach rather than from your colon. Dr. Christopher, one of my teachers, he always said, diarrhea is the worst form of constipation. When your bowels get to the very loose stage where it's just like passing water, none of the fluid in your bowel is able to pass through the mucous membrane. And so, when we look at this and Dr. Jensen's amazing method through the kalima and the nutrients and the foods that he would give people, how the mucous membrane could actually be passed all at once. And those of us that have had colonics, particularly the herbal ones like at Rasayana where they have that same colonic system here, you see huge long strings and lumps of mucus coming out of the colon. And you also see it with just the herbs. I mean, if you use the castor oil packs, if you use the nutrients, you use the juices and the right kind of foods, and you do some enemas and occasionally castor oil packs, reflexology, it can be done. Cyprium drinks and so on, it can be done, but it takes longer. It is very useful at a certain time during your healing process to have colonics. And once again, here's the Kalima board down here showing the system, the little tube. And there's Dr. Jensen holding, see these amazing things that came out of people's. So we have to face the reality of that. Absolutely, that's what's holding us back. If we want to develop these crystalline evolutionary patterns and move on in our existence to higher and more subtle and more beautiful thoughts and feelings, we have to let go. We absolutely have to let go. We have to speak the truth and live the truth. And one of my favorite charts, one of my own. Because what I love to do here is show all the different ways that the nervous system appears in the eye. And there's a lot of them. As I started putting this together, I was amazed. The nervous system, here we have the central nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, the solar plexus, the adrenals, the ears, all the sense organs, the tongue, the size of the pupil. So many different ways that the nerve rings themselves, how the radii solaris break through and affect and weaken. So many ways the nervous system appears in the eyes. Of course, digestive nervous system, all of the systems are really, really important. But for living, the nervous and digestive systems are so important because they affect each other so much. The weaker the nervous system is, the harder it is to digest and to be calm. The worse the digestive system is, the harder it is for the nervous system to receive the nutrient and to feel calm. It becomes a never-ending cycle. And if you've ever been really, really stressed and then done a cleanse and a colon cleanse and ate simple foods and all of a sudden start sleeping better and feeling better and relaxing, you can live the understanding of this truth and know how to guide other people in the same process. Now this is a chart from Angerer's book, a German iridologist who loved basically to draw irises, and I'm going to show you some of his drawings later on. He really inspired me to develop my skills at drawing irises, and he's relating all these different things. These are the Chinese medicine timings of when the organs are most active in the AM and PM. The red ring is the sympathetic phase. The sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system receives energy from the world, opens up to it, interacts with it. It's the eyes of a young child. It's the nervous system, the day nervous system of the very alive and awake interactive person. And then we have the blue ring. I don't have the colors here. Parasympathetic phase, a resistance to life, going to sleep, pulling the curtains, wanting to rest, wanting to shut down. So opening to light, resistance to light, and then the outer ring, times of maximal functioning of the organs. The rhythm of the human functions analogous to the cosmic rhythm of night and day, activity and rest, and to the total vegetative control, vegetative nervous system. So he's saying here with this very complex and very beautiful drawing here, how we expand and contract with the nervous system through the day and through the night. And we're going actually to move on to...
What was his name again?
Angerer.
Angerer.
Yes. And here you see we have a drawing of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And this is a very important teaching to go along with iridology to understand how the parasympathetic will activate certain things and shut down other things. Just as sympathetic does the same thing. The sympathetic will activate and deactivate. And so when you're active and alive, your heart is moving, your digestion's moving, but at nighttime your digestive system shuts down. So at nighttime you don't want to eat a huge meal and then go to sleep. You want to have your big main meal in the day and walk afterwards and exercise and facilitate digestion. And then when you go to sleep, you don't want everything to be really active. You want it to be restful. And so to understand both sides of the nervous system and how they work together and how important it is to be able to access both sides of the nervous system, to be able to completely rest and to let go, and or to be, to be fully active. And many, many people, when you start taking case histories, are actually dominant in one or the other, overactive or underactive. And especially with older people, they become more and more parasympathetic dominant. They lose interest in the world. They don't have the energy to interact because they feel tired or uninterested. Their brain function isn't so well. They tend to dream. They tend to watch TV. They tend to sleep or sit around. And so you can see how as a person ages, the pupil becomes smaller and smaller. And in England, I was able to work with so many elderly people over the years and to really see the small pupils, to see it particularly in that country where you have very, very mineralized water, high amounts of sugar, high amounts of salt, high amounts of fried food, hardly any sun, hardly any exercise, tons of tea, sweets, candies. And you see the effect of that in an elderly person. The eye becomes very wide and filled with arthritis and rheumatism. They become very rigid and brittle. Their faculties shut down. The pupil becomes very small. And so you begin to understand how important it is to really study the sympathetic parasympathetic. If a person has an overactive blood, or you can relate these things. And this is my chart from my book here. The pupillary dilation is the sympathetic, the pupillary contraction is the parasympathetic. And when the person is in the day nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, the heart is going The lungs are breathing, the stomach is relaxed and digesting well, the intestines are relaxed and doing peristalsis. And the bladder is relaxed. And over here we have the bladder contracted. And over here we have the lungs decelerated, breathing deepens and slows, the heart calms down. The saliva glands, interestingly enough, secrete at night and go into the stomach. I find that fascinating. So there's many different aspects. This was just a very simple chart, but in your anatomy and physiology books, I highly encourage you to really study this quite deeply so that you understand. And then when you give nerve herbs and you give treatment, then you can really watch the progress, and the symptoms change. Now this pupillary membrane is something that happens during the birth usually. So if you see it, you don't think prolapse. There's many ophthalmological conditions that happen, and you can get books from the library on ophthalmology, the diseases of the eye, the conditions of the eye, to understand how before birth this pupillary membrane bursts over the pupil and creates the shape of the wreath. But sometimes in creating the shape of the wreath, it creates an aberrant pattern, and so we don't want to get this mixed up when we see a loose filament on the autonomic nerve wreath, that it actually means that it's a prolapse. I have one of those, and it floats, goes up and down. And you can watch it sometimes when you breathe. And when you use it, by a microscope and so on, you can really see how the eye breathes, the most amazing thing. It's expanding and contracting, and everything in your body is. Whenever you have cranial or study cranial, any aspect of body breathing, everything is expanding and contracting and going up and down and extending and shortening. It's the most amazing thing. And the same thing is happening in the iris. And so a membrane like that, one time you look at an eye, it might be up, and another time you look at it, it might be down into the pupil. So don't get scared or frightened. And certainly don't scare and frighten the person you're looking at. It's just one of those things. And here we have zigzag fibers. The larger the pupil is, the more the fibers will bend. The smaller the pupil is, the more the fibers will straighten. Something you have to remember. You have to be able to look at the person and see the size of the pupil and make some compensation of understanding of the size of the pupil affecting the shape of the fibers. And then all these different possibilities of nerve rings. Just on the right eye, just on the left eye. Shoulder to groin is very popular. See that again and again and again. If you hold your hand and tighten it, like that, everyone, what happens is the tension goes all the way, and you can feel it in your shoulder. So you almost have to imagine, if the shoulder is tight, that it spreads through the torso. And it also very, very, very often goes from shoulder to kidney. Is a very common one. So you have shoulder to kidney, and you have them in the lymph zone. You have them in the deep tissue zone, also very close to the very edge of the pupil sometimes. So you have them in many different patterns, and it's important to see where they start and where they finish. They tell us a story. Sometimes they're just around the reproductive areas. Sometimes they're just around like a liver. One time I saw them appear in a woman's eye near to an ovary after she had radiation. She didn't have them before. After the radiation, the nerve rings appeared up on either side of the ovary. Then she went away for several weeks to Scotland to recover and to have a holiday. When she came back, the nerve rings had gone again. That was very interesting. In those days, of course, I didn't document things, but I've seen these things to be true. Sometimes they're in the head zone, and or in the brain zone as well. And so when you're looking at an iris and drawing an iris or analyzing an iris photograph, definitely pay attention to where nerve rings stop and start, and how they would influence, different organ systems or glands. Now, the pupillary margin is related to the spinal cord. The bottom of the pupillary zone, sacrum. And here we have the lumbar section, thoracic section, cervical section, and the atlas. So often when we see an iris, there will be a flattening or sometimes a differentiation which can be very strong in those little pupillary round segments, you know, that go around. So you can watch for, particularly in the chiropractic field, when you're working with the nervous system, and often also when people have mental emotional disorders. I mean, my first experience, long before I ever saw a chart like this or even knew that it existed, I had a client in England who I met because her son had done all the cabinets for my house, for my kitchen in England. And he said, my mother has this very strange disorder and she has to be on heavy medication. He said if she's not on the medication, she'll go out for a walk in the morning and she will walk until she passes out. She will not be able to stop. And she said if she also starts to clean her house, whatever she would start to do, she would be unable to stop. And until she passed out or fainted. And, you know, they had to keep her on all these drugs. And so I said, well, sure, you know, I'll take a look at her. And when I looked at her, she had this very strong, huge black marking exactly on the edge of the pupil here and relating to what I now call the anxiety area of the brain, which is opposite the kidney adrenals. And it was huge and it was black. And I remember saying to her, you know, do you have any sensation in this part of your body? And she said, oh yeah. She said, on the top of my stomach here, she said, I just always feel like there's this big lump. And, you know, so I put her on the program. I started treating her, had her do Castor-Opex, gave her reflexology. And, you know, eventually she absolutely went off the drugs and this whole pattern started. But the unfortunate part was that she went out and got a boyfriend and got married and then lost her divorce settlement. So I solved her son-in-law's problem from one side, but then he got solved another problem on the other side because she left this new husband shortly afterward. She had no income. So anyway, sometimes, you know, fixing things on one side, I mean, can really shift things around. But it was quite extraordinary for me to have that lesson of seeing how this large black shape on the pupillary margin had actually moved up and was influencing this brain area and causing this incredibly. She had a very strong radial right up into the brain area. And this is where you really do your best learning. Never forget it. Never forget a lesson like that. Now this chart here was created by Willie Hauser when I brought him to England in the 1980s. I went over to Germany, met him in his clinic, and he took me to meet Joseph Deck. We went out to dinner. And Joseph Deck had already had one stroke and was partly paralyzed and couldn't really speak. But he was able to take me to his clinic and show me his beautiful photographs, and we all went out to dinner. And it was very interesting to me, being a naturopath, that a person with a heart condition and a stroke ordered a huge steak and a spoonful of peas. And so thus began a very interesting conversation between Willie Hauser, Joseph Deck, and myself, between cause and effect, naturopathy, diet, because they were completely brilliant in one amazing, huge area. And Willie Hauser had a magnificent several-story clinic where people would come with multiple sclerosis, and they would go once a month, and they would go through all of these procedures, you know, rolling metal things on the back, you know, with oils and breathing oxygen and injecting oxygen and all these homeopathies and amazing assortment of treatments. And the people would go away almost symptom-free, but they would have to come back every month. But as far as I could see, there wasn't really any of the work that I do. And so it was very, very interesting. And I said to Willie Hauser, I said, why don't you I have a copy of my course here, my Iridology course. Why don't you take it home with you and look at it tonight? And so the next morning I went to his clinic and he looked at me and he said, this is amazing. I stayed up all night long. I just can't believe it. This is a whole other area of Iridology and everything. And so I ended up bringing him to England a couple of times, and he actually learned English in order to come to be able to speak to the students. I believe I brought him over twice. Joseph Deck was too ill to travel, and Joseph Deck also passed away shortly after that. But it was a very exciting intermingling, you know, because they had such amazing information that we didn't have, and vice versa. So on this chart here, because of their approach to Iridology, which was very much about chronic illness death in war by wounds and fevers, through Joseph Deck's work, looking at people shortly before they passed away and that sort of thing, they had a very strong sense of where problems would occur, so that when you look at their work, they're always talking about, you know, future organ failure, organ insufficiency. So when I put Dorothy Hall and the Germans together, that was fascinating, because along comes Dorothy Hall, and she's saying, lacunas are wonderful, lacunas are creative, expressive, you know, lacunas are emotional, and, you know, and they're just going, cancer, organ insufficiency, death. You know, so it was a kind of intermingling of different approaches, and then adding in all my naturopathies. So it was this great time where ideas traveled and we learned from each other. But this is one of the things that, you know, that he brought to England when he did his class. And he wasn't able to really talk to people very much, but he put so much work into to learn English, and then to have somebody help him prepare all his lectures so that he could speak it. Now this is one of Ghadfan Safi's drawing, the student from Lebanon, the graduate who now has a school and a clinic, and who appears on Lebanese TV on a regular basis, and who used to be a person who built palaces in Saudi Arabia. And he has these beautiful skills of drawing and lettering and so on, because he used to make up the plans and follow through with the building of palaces. So now he's pretty much focusing on the temple of the human body, a big shift for him. And he was able to draw all the different types of lacuna in this one drawing. Very beautiful. In the coloring book of Iridology and the dictionary of Iridology, we have the results of many, many nights spent in Saudi Arabia on his own after doing his work, sitting in front of iris slides, in front of his computer, studying and learning and being very, very creative at the same time. And so we always thank and honor Ghadfan for his contribution. The different kinds of lacuna, the main one to really watch out for is the asparagus lacuna. Over the years I've had some amazing experiences with people where you see the darkness flowing into one of these and collecting at the tip. And indeed, those were very advanced cases, often of cancer. And the moment I see one of those in a person's eye, if it's black and collected, I send them to a doctor if they haven't been. I send them to osteopath for x-rays or whatever, because, and interestingly enough, this little shoe one, regardless of where it may be in the eye, has to do with kidney. You often see these large open lacuna that have the fibers flowing through them, either in the kidney area or in the respiratory areas. Butterfly lacunas, open ones, closed ones, ones with fibers inside of them. The liver stake, it's a darkening of the liver zone and the lymph and circulation areas. And then again, from my book, these different shapes of lacunas, and eventually you learn them. But it isn't that you have to say, this is a leaf lacuna, what next? You just see it's there and you see where it is. But when you see everything from the inner ecology point of view, it's the total picture that brings the result, and it's the restoring of the internal harmony which creates the healing. It's not about all the separate little pieces. They give you the information to guide the program, to create the herbal formula, to educate the person, maybe perhaps to describe why they have a symptom where they do, and then also the cause could be somewhere else. But it isn't that you have to know every single thing about every little lacuna or mark or fiber. So you just take everything in perspective from this approach. Different kinds of lacuna again. I have seen one in the head, and that woman had very, very, very strong mental and emotional problems. And when she first came to class, the first seminar in England, she was practically bald, and I thought, oh, she's a Buddhist. But as it turns out, she had one of those strong fixations about cleanliness and order, and she dressed like in very sort of simple, tight clothes, and couldn't stand to have her hair grow long. And she was a teacher, and she used to spend all summer, every summer, in her teaching room, in her school, preparing her teaching materials for the next year. and she had not spoken to any member of her family for over 12 years and had not completed a divorce from her husband in about the same length of time. And during her healing process, without her making one phone call, every single person in her family and her husband appeared in her life to reconcile and complete an open communication. It was really extraordinary. And she ended up running around the world with Ravi, this amazing graduate from England, helping him teach and doing all kinds of things because he developed this huge clinic. And it was so amazing. I mean, her hair grew long and it curled, and I mean, she just blossomed as a being, you know, in so many ways. But that was the only asparagus lacuna I ever saw in a mental area. Different kinds of lacuna, again, shingles, steps. And you can go into the detail. And certainly in Angerer's book, he goes into the details in all kinds of extraordinary ways. But for my work, I find that I don't need to, because those symptoms take care of themselves during the process of healing. Now this is interesting because we have lacuna outside of the wreath, and we have lacuna inside the wreath that have to do with the secretion of enzymes and digestion. And so excretory glands that help us to digest and eliminate, and incretory ones to do with, you know, the processes outside of the wreath. It's just good to know that lacunas are there, and you will see them from time to time. So the genetics of iris markings, this is from Deck's book. He's saying that certain things are genetic and other things develop during life according to how you live and the extremes. There's not a lot of things you can see unless you see an iris over a long period of time. If we were able to document a child's eye from a very early age and then photograph them at regular intervals, or photograph them after trauma or extremely stressful times, I'm sure that there's a lot that we could learn about how the eye changes in life itself. But often when you see a person, you don't really know the way, of course, that their eyes were when they were born. You don't know what has happened during their lifetime. But he's saying that there are certain markings that are genetic from the very beginning. And it is very interesting to look at a young child's eyes and see the patterns already established there. And especially as with my grandchildren, one is an anxiety gastric type and one is a lymphatic sensitive type, and to see the difference in their nature and personality and in their learning and how they interact. One always wants more food, the other one wants less. The one with the anxiety gastric, whenever she's emotional or upset or tired, she won't take food. And that's wisdom for her type, because her type doesn't digest well if there is emotional upset. But the one with the lymphatic sensitive, she just seems to be comforted by food whenever she needs something. And these are, so you can learn a lot in young children's eyes as well by watching as they develop. Once again, the most important thing on this page really are the reflexive fibers, how certain fibers will rise up in acute stages and swell. First of all, they become swollen, then they become white, and then they become very, very bright white, and then they become pink, and eventually some of them become absolutely brilliant red. And so if they develop, along that stage, it can be quite painful. People who have lower back problems or heart difficulties, so on, these, some of the patterns can be quite strong. Now this is interesting also because you will have parafocal defects, which are markings inside of lacunas. Parafocal pigmentation, around pigmentation. Parafocal pigmentation next to something. See, there's a lacuna and then there's the pigmentation. Here the pigmentation is inside. And then we also have perifocal reflexive fibers, where we have swollen fibers in association with a lacuna or a diamond-shaped lacuna and so on. Or here's a lacuna that's divided. And so whenever you have two signs coming together, three signs coming together, there's always more of an augmentation, or the iris is telling you something more strongly. Most of the time I like symptoms to disappear from the inside out. I like them to disappear from the cause, not take them away and then the person just goes back and lives and does what they were doing before. And so this is always a very fine line when working with someone. What symptoms do you want to relieve, and which symptoms do you wish to stay there until the cause is gone? And to really, cooperate and communicate with the person so they understand that. And these tiny little marks here on Millie Hauser's teaching slide, they are very tiny, and unless you have a really good magnifying glass, a lot of the time you don't even notice them. But what he discovered in the war and in his work in hospitals was that often these tiny ones were where the death process actually took place. And I have had absolutely no experience of being around someone who is dying or around someone that I was able to observe that process. I have had in England certain people come to my clinic brought by relatives who were very close to death, who were either in pain or fear, some emotional state, and I was able to work with them and to get them to relax and to release and let go. And in all cases, the family members reported to me, one even visited me to thank me for the helping of that process. This work would be so valuable, and there's a lot of good hospice work going on, but it would be very helpful. And in many kinds, actually all you had to do in many cases was really just get the bowels working again. Because almost so many people, they become so fearful and so tense when they're in their dying process, their whole body just locks up, and the more constipated they are, the worse everything gets and the more painful everything gets. And so there's great wisdom, and indeed a lot of students over the years have gone into caring for the elderly, holistic nursing, hospice work, because they found that they were able to really contribute, to helping people in their later stages of life. And they are very tiny. I think we will be able to see some of them most beautifully in the slides in PowerPoint now, because we're getting such a large, magnification. It's a lot easier to show you things now than slides. And transversals, I believe, it seems to be the discovery of the German iridologist. Dorothy Hall had never heard of them, or didn't know what they were, and hadn't really considered them deeply, nor Jensen. And so that was exciting for them to learn about the German work. Because transversals, these fibers that run across the fibers of the iris in kind of antler or fork shapes, it's as though the almost like the circulatory level from underneath is coming up and spreading and creating a new kind of communication. And I saw these in the German work and started looking for them. And once I got this wonderful German magnifier, in 1989 I bought it in South Africa from Willie Hauser's sister, who was in South Africa, and I tried so many times to buy this, but I guess they don't make it anymore. It just shows a magnificent magnification of the iris, and I also wear magnification glasses as well. But it's very important to have a good instrument to look at the eye. That's why photographs are now helping us so much as well. So transversals, the first time I ever saw them in a case, she's now a graduate of the school, but it was a woman who had just finished her master's degree. And it was a pattern that had begun in childhood of having to prove herself and to be, a top-A student. She had a very dysfunctional family, and she said that she spent most of her childhood as a young girl under the bed or in the closet because she was so afraid of her mother's anxiety and rage attacks. And she was not allowed to go outside and play. And so, but then when she went into school, what she did is she focused on school and just became the student, and went all the way through university and was doing her PhD thesis, and in some kind of religious topic, I can't remember quite what, but anyway, during that process, she went through a complete breakdown, mental, physical, emotional. And when I met her, she was bedridden almost all the time. She couldn't shop, she couldn't walk, she had no reserves of energy. She watched videos, she meditated, she listened to music. And thank heavens she had a good husband who was taking care of her. And she'd say, oh, my liver just hurts all the time, and oh, my kidneys hurt. And I mean, she just, like, her whole body was like pain and complete exhaustion. And so when I looked in her eyes, the first thing I saw were transversals in her kidneys and liver and spleen, major ones. And that was my first experience. And while they're there today, they're quieter and calmer. She went through many years of healing. She eventually, when she got better, she became a student of the school. She also became a yoga teacher, and she studied many things. And then they inherited money, and now they live way up in the mountains. And she just has this leisurely life. And I visited her last September, and she was just walking up and down the hills in Estes Park, and full of life, and it was amazing to see her transformation. And she's an artist, and she does a lot of artwork now. So transversals, like anything else, can be very different. They go across the fibers. They can be kind of straight. They can be curved. They can be related, to a lacuna. They can have like roots coming out of them, and some of them are like forks or antlers. They have branches. And here's a picture from Deck's book, what it looks like. And if you see them on a liver, or kidney, or spleen, or some major organ, you really can notice them once you know what they mean. You can actually really pay attention. This is latent cancer marking. But it seems to be some huge kind of, for me, energetic overload on all levels, not just physical. Because when you think of the liver, it has to do with repressed anger. And when you think of the kidneys, it has to do with creativity, of which the ultimate creativity is the freedom and courage to be yourself. And when you think of energetically, not only just the physical, all the different levels, the focus of energy on those organs, it's like the transversal itself is telling you a lot when it's swollen. And here's some more of the shapes of the transversals, moving to the fork of the antlers sometimes, but more rarely up in the head. Vascularized when they're really, really swollen. Sometimes they can be angular. These are quite common. And they often run right across the kidney, or run right across the liver, just like that. Now the relationship of the iris to sclerology is another topic as well. Sclerology is not something I've gone very, very deeply into as a separate study. And certainly Leonard Mailmauer is the one to go to if the sclera calls you. I pay attention to how they point to particular areas, how they augment the iris, the colors of them, the shapes of them. And yeah, it's Leonard Mailmauer, it's the Grand Medicine website. And you can certainly ask me the address of that. I highly encourage you to get on his mailing list. He sends out lessons, sclerology lessons. He has absolutely wonderful trainings, and he's a very bright light. Sclerology and red markings on the eye, on the sclera, pointing to the iris in all kinds of different ways. This is the chart from my book. It's the one that I drew many years ago. And this, I was absolutely delighted to find, are ancient Chinese sclerology markings and the translations of the Chinese. Gallbladder, spleen, liver, pericardium, small intestine. So it's kidney underneath. So this is amazing. Here they were paying attention to sclerology in 1046 AD. Isn't that wonderful? And this is a chart that somebody has drawn. Her name? There it is. Audrey Martin. I think she's from Canada. Woodland. But she just extended the lung area out into the sclera, extended the shoulder out, extended the sinus. there's a lot more coming in there than just the sinus to do with, spiritual, mental, psychic phenomena. One of the things in the RAID model, which we'll be studying later, Denny was my neighbor for several years, and at one point we were very interested in sclerology, and we would communicate to each other if we had a case or an insight about a sclerology marking. And I had an experience in the institute in Bangalore, the Naturopathic and Yogic Institute, where a woman had joined a group of students that I had taken there because she heard that we were going. Someone who was on the same meditation path with myself, actually a British lady, and she had cancer. And she was in India trying to heal herself. And so we said, oh yes, come along to the institute. But when she was at the institute, she couldn't relax for a moment. Every single day she had to be on the long-distance telephone. If you've ever been in India, it's really hard to call, let alone long distance. And you have to wait, and then you have to yell. And every day she would spend all this time trying to get through to her family. And then this one day she could not get through to her family, and she just really started losing it. She got so incredibly upset. And of course she was afraid of dying and afraid of leaving them forever, and there was many dimensions into that. And the very next morning when she came in for breakfast, there she was with this huge red marking that had appeared overnight in her iris. And I told this to Denny, I said, there's something in this. There's something in here about attachment. There's something in here about a really strong connection to something, And I don't remember at this time what part of her iris showed up with that. But I do know that I've had experiences like that over the years where actually the red marks have appeared under extremely stressful situations and in particular places in the iris. I remember that it was on the outside of the iris, not the inside. And so there, in my book also, we have a lot of sclerosines, and we'll just very briefly go through these because you can study them. And I don't really have a lot of comments. There's the cholesterol deposits on all the different types. The snake ones are quite common, but I don't study them and go into all the different details about all of them. But what I do notice is that the more purification and regeneration, the more restoring of the harmony, the inner ecology of the person, the less red markings there are in the eye, and then eventually your eyes are completely white. That's what I see as the truth. The beginning is the end. Follow the eye light to the source. That's what I've always loved to write in my Iridology book when I sign it for people. Follow the eye light to the source.